Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to turn your post notifications so you don't miss any of our new videos. And now let's get right into it. February 29th. The day that Middlefield changed forever. You probably haven't heard of Middlefield, Oregon, because it doesn't exist anymore. It does exist anymore because of him. And that all started on February 29th, 1988, with the disappearance of Carol Grott. It was raining the day that Carol Grott disappeared. She was 15, 2 years younger than me. Middlefield was pretty small, a few thousand people, and no records of it now. But back then, before Carol went missing, it was a pretty calm little town. Situated near the border of Idaho and Oregon, it's one of those farm towns where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever happens. At least, nothing ever happened until February 29th, all those years ago. That day, all of us walked to school, just like any other day. The school was a plain building, 6 stories with a track and a football field that also served for soccer. Not that we really had many sports. There were only 400 students from kindergarten up. It was impossible not to know everyone, and even more impossible to not know everyone's business. Carol never showed up. The teachers called her parents, who were concerned but not too concerned. It wasn't unheard of for kids to occasionally play hooky or to sneak off somewhere with someone of the opposite, most of the time, sex. Of course, word got around then. We all knew she wasn't there, and it was most of what we talked about on the walk home. I thought she'd be grounded for a few days. Freddie, my younger brother, said he bet her parents would make her help when their cow birthed its next calf. Even after all these years, I never got over the disgusting nature of helping birth a calf. That night we ate dinner, did our homework, and went to sleep. I remember that my dad was still in the living room, the news blaring into my bedroom. My door was open just the slightest bit, and I fell asleep with the picture dancing over my ceiling, flickering light that seemed to extend beyond the window, into our fields, beyond. Next morning, I woke up to my mother shaking me. "Laura," she said softly, her hand on my shoulder. "Laura, baby, wake up, wake up." Birds were chirping. The sun was streaming in through my window. The rain had stopped. I remember groaning, turning over in bed. "I don't want to go to school," I said, like I said every day. "There's no school today," my mom told me. "Get up, Laura. The police are here." I feel so guilty now for what I was thinking. I remember thinking they'd caught wind of me and Jeremy Cow tipping a few weekends ago. They knew about the empty beer bottles we'd buried in the Smiths' backyard. They were aware that Charlotte McDonald was no longer a virgin, and she'd been pregnant and had tried to give herself an abortion by throwing herself down the barn stairs. I got up and changed out of my nightgown, sleep still clinging to the corners of my eyes as I came outside. True to my mother's word, there were 3 cops sitting at the living room table. Sheriff Williams was there, smack dab in the middle, and that's how I knew I'd fucked up big time. But of course, it was about Carol Grott. And again, I can't forgive myself for ever being relieved that I wasn't in trouble. "Laura, have you heard from Carol lately? Any word that maybe she wasn't happy at home?" I looked from one of my parents to the other. They gave me blank stares in return. Carol and I weren't very close, but no, I didn't hear anything. "Well, we know you and the Jenks boy are close." Their words for dating. "His sister is quite close with Carol, and so we wondered if maybe when you were around the Jenks place, you'd ever heard anything, eavesdropped, been privy to any information." I shook my head. My father was sitting in his chair at the end of the table, a coffee mug between his 2 palms. His hair was still brown back then. I remember his face, the solemnness of it, like he knew what was coming. The wrinkles between his eyebrows were just starting, the flesh on his cheeks just beginning to sag. He was already preparing for it, he just didn't know it back then. "Sheriff Williams, is Carol in trouble?" The sheriff looked from me to his officers, to my parents. "Carol never came home last night." Have you ever felt your blood turn to ice in your veins? Like the feeling of getting caught in a really big lie, when your face grows hot and your stomach feels like pure acid driving against your insides, eating away at you? The kind of panic that manifests in shaking and shivering, trembling. It was like the whole world was filled with water. Everyone was sitting at the table, still and somber and grounded, and I was just trying to find which way was up. That's when I started hyperventilating. I don't know why it bothered me so much. Like I'd told the sheriff, I didn't know Carol very well. Yes, she was Jeremy's sister's friend, but that's a lot of removal. She was 2 years younger than me. Different class at school. I only knew her as the girl with the long yellow curls, the blue eyes, the cotton dresses she was partial to. I remember those cotton dresses because she was wearing one in the missing poster. They went up that same day, March 1st, all over town. Carol looking down at us, smiling like she'd never been taken. As for all of us, school was canceled for quite some time. It was canceled for a week because all the teachers were in the search party and half of the seniors and juniors too. We searched the woods, the fields, neighboring areas. We drove all the way down to Twin Cities and all the way to Salem. We called the highway patrol of 5 different states: Nevada, California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington. None of it mattered, because she showed up on a Tuesday. At least, her body showed up on a Tuesday. It was found on the side of the highway leading out of town. Right there on the side of the road, laid out with an orchid sitting on her forehead. The rumor was, and all I got were rumors, because the adults were worried that we couldn't handle the truth, at least for Carol, at least not until more started disappearing. The rumor was that she'd been found with her eyes wide open, staring at the sky, blue marbles. The orchid had been arranged so that the long tendrils of roots were planted into her ears and nose and mouth. The stems leading up out of her body, flowers pointed to the sky. She'd been dressed in white, the rumors went. A white dress, laid out on the side of the road, dead. There were other whispered rumors. Things like sexual assault and rape were whispered quite a bit. Apparently, the ME had thrown up when he looked beneath that white dress. He said it was the bruises and what was done to her down there. It was noted, also, that Carol was missing a foot. As for the official cause of death, we didn't know. The ME had no idea, said there was no sign of strangulation, stabbing, asphyxiation. He said of all things, Carol, 15-year-old Carol, had had a heart attack. Post-mortem, the orchid had been planted inside of her. Indeed, her brain had been scooped out, severed at the optic nerves. Her skull had been turned into nothing but a pot. But why she had died, the exact method of his killings? I wish I still didn't know. The truth is, I do know. I know exactly what he did to his victims. I know because I was his last. And I know how Carol died, because I was there when Freddie died. He took us. He kept us. I'm the only one who got out alive. We weren't allowed to watch the news for some time after Carol's body was found. There were pictures that showed what had been done to her head. But rumors flew rampant at school back then, and we all knew how the orchid had found its place inside of her. The back of her head, a long, slim incision made at the base of her skull, another at the base of her jaw. The skin had been peeled up. The tendrils of orchid roots had been snuck inside her nose and ears. Some surgery had been done on the plant, too. It had apparently died within days of Carol's body being found. The worse rumors said that the surgeon had carefully planted the orchid within her skull after her death. There were rumors about how she died, spontaneous heart attack, injected with a drug that couldn't show up on the screenings, psychologically tortured, raped. The list went on. The worst rumors said that the surgeon had carefully planted the orchid before her death. How that was possible, I didn't know. It made me sick to think of it. It made my stomach turn, the acid and bile scrubbing against my insides until I had to excuse myself. That's what I did frequently those days. Carol hadn't been my friend, but I could still see her. I could see her in the hallways, smiling as she opened her locker. And when I vomited, the bile rushing up out of my stomach and into whatever vehicle I had managed to reach, the image of hair pain and suffering almost transferred to me. I knew what she was feeling. I thought I knew. Middlefield was under curfew. We had to be home before dark, and it was suggested against leaving the house before first light. Of course, most of the farmers didn't listen to this. They had to be out and about before the sun came up. But there was no problem. Middlefield had a small police force, but they were pulling all-nighters patrolling the town. More volunteers signed up. City police came down from Eugene to help. There were even some fancy detectives who walked around in ties and carried their badges on their belts, right next to their guns. One night, 3 weeks after Carol's body had been discovered, I heard a noise outside the house. My room was on the second floor. My brother and I shared a wall, with our parents' bedroom down a small hallway and separated by a bathroom. Freddie and I both had windows that pointed outside to the street, though his window was partially obscured by the branches of an old oak that grew on our property. I thought at first the noise was a patrol. It sounded like rustling, someone going through our garbage. Then I thought that maybe it was raccoons there looking for food. The rustling was loud, a clanging of glass on tin and footsteps. I swear I could hear grunts. I could hear someone making an effort, really going through their paces. My heart was pounding. Trying to be quiet, I grasped around in my nightstand for the flashlight, rolling out of bed and going to the window. There were more grunts and crashes, and then a quiet curse. My heart skipped a beat, the blood in my veins turning to ice as I slowly pushed the window up and held out the flashlight. Turn it on, I thought to myself. It's just a policeman. It's nothing. It's Dad, trying to do some late-night work. He threw out something he didn't mean to. I took a deep, shuddering breath. Still holding the flashlight aloft but unlit, I said out into the night, "Hello?" The rustling stopped. There was the snap of a twig, the sound of footsteps. "Hello?" I said again, more loudly. "Dad? Sheriff Williams?" There was silence on the other end. I waited, my heart pounding. I was scared to turn on the flashlight. I didn't know what I would see if I did. I held my breath and clicked on the flashlight, sweeping it over the yard. There was a scuffling near the base of the house, by the trunk of the oak tree. I hitched the window up more, leaning out of it and sweeping the light over the grass. But there was no one there. Slowly, I clicked the flashlight off and closed the window. I latched it, staring outside at the road for a long time. I half expected someone to come out of the dark or yell, "Boo!" But there was no one there. No one came. I went back to bed. I dreamed of rustling noises, of orchids, of screeching laughter. The next morning, our neighbors, the McDonalds, found a severed foot on their porch. Their daughter, Charlotte, had been taken from her bed, but she wasn't the only one. My boyfriend, Jeremy, was gone too. Before Carol Grott, there weren't any murders in Middlefield's history. Sure, sometimes cowhands got into fights when they'd had one too many beers at the bar, and that ended with Sheriff Williams carting them off to the one-cell jailhouse so they could work some stuff out. But there was never really any serious crime. Cow-tipping, underage drinking, and sex were part of growing up. Of course, just because there aren't murders don't mean there aren't deaths. The old church down the road from the Jenks place joked that they hosted as many wakes as they did sermons, since Sunday morning was a day to sleep in after a hard week's work. Mr. Tom White doubled as a pastor and the county veterinarian, specializing in equine births or something of the like, so he was often tired too, and more than happy to hold off a sermon in return for another few hours of sleep. Life didn't take a break in Middlefield, is what I'm saying. Babies were occasionally born, old folks died. There were tragedies on occasion as well. 10 years before I was born, a boy belonging to the Millers had drowned when he went up to Lake Awihi on his own. His body had never been found. When I was 5, a young boy hung himself in his parents' barn for reasons my dad would never speak of. There were rumors, of course, but nothing ever came of them. Similarly, just 2 years before Carol Grott disappeared, one of my friends had died going into labor. She was 20 and married, so no scandal there, but it was sad to say the least. The thing about the surgeon is he never really gave us time to have peace. He wasn't, of course, officially a serial killer until Jeremy and Charlotte's bodies turned up, but that wasn't until June. In the meantime, I'd turned. The search never really wound down. We were always on the edges of our seats, just waiting for the two to turn up. The detectives, 2 white somethings who had driven down all the way from Portland, seemed at a loss. The extra police from Eugene would get in their cars to drive home, only to come back again, claiming they couldn't bear it if another kid was taken and they had just given up. But we were all losing hope toward the end of May. School was back in session and finished. Freddie had a summer vacation, and I had the rest of my life. Of course, I hadn't applied to college, my family didn't have the money, and what good would it do me to have a college education if I was just going to work on a farm my whole life? Once upon a time, Jeremy and I had talked about getting married and moving to Bend or Eugene or Salem, starting up our own family or a little farm, or maybe even a bookstore or a restaurant. We didn't have any set-in-stone goals. We only wanted something exciting and new. June 5th, 1988, was the day of my graduation ceremony from high school. I got to put on the cap and gown with my small class of seniors, and we were to sit on fold-out chairs on the football field in the blazing sun while Mayor Radcliffe gave some speech about education, and then we'd all go home and have barbecue or else play a friendly game of soccer or football, and the next day, some of us were planning to truck up to Lake Owyhee and go swimming. But those things never happened, I'm sure you could guess, because June 5 was the day that Jeremy came back into my life. I was the one who found Jeremy. I think it must have been planned that way. I think during his imprisonment with the surgeon, Jeremy must have told all about Middlefield, maybe even all about me. I found Jeremy from my bedroom window, looking out at the road and watching the dawn on the day that I was supposed to get my diploma. I knew what it was before I even really knew what it was. That doesn't make sense, I know. But I ran down the stairs and out into the front yard without thinking about it, and there he was. His hair had been trimmed, and he didn't have a beard. His eyes, brown and empty and staring up at the lightning sky, obscured only by the large purple petals of the orchid that had been planted on his face. His mouth was opened wide, and the long tentacle roots had been somehow planted through his nose and were emerging again through his mouth, snaking their way down his chin. It looked like he was vomiting roots, his mouth hinged open with those green snake-like veins coming out. Stem and leaves and even a bit of root were coming from his nose, reaching to the sky. I was sick, of course. I can't remember much, but that image. Someone must have found me, because I heard screaming. I leaned down and tried to put him in my arms. He was dressed in white, a white shirt that had been starched so stiff it felt like cardboard under my hands, and white slacks, and white shoes. All white. As I held him, the screaming got louder, like there were more people joining, and I heard my dad calling my name, and then he was yelling too. There were lights, blue and red, flashing. Screaming, screaming, screaming. It hurt my ears. It hurt my head. And it was only when Sheriff Williams squatted down beside me and put his hand on my shoulder that I realized the screaming was coming from me. That's all I remember. What I've heard since is that my dad carried me up the stairs and put me in my bed, and the doctor came around and gave me a sedative, and I slept for almost a week straight on drugs, dreaming of nothing and remembering nothing, and coming around only to learn from Freddie that Charlotte's body had turned up too, and that Tom White Jr. and Olivia Frank and Sandy Green had been taken. And there had been a foot on the Franks' porch, and also on the Whites' porch, but not the Greens, and that the detectives figured the surgeon was trying to figure out how much damage he could do and how many he could take all at once. I stopped going out. I just wanted to stay in bed. The doctor came, and Freddie came and sat by my bed, and even a specialist from Eugenie came to talk to me about trauma and grief. There were different pills to take, and most of them make those next few weeks before the latest 3 turned up fuzzy. That's how I learned the details then, in a state of half-consciousness. So I hope you'll forgive me if I don't get them all right. The ME had found that Jeremy's death was as inexplicable as Carol's. Charlotte's death, though, had been by strangulation. There was nothing forensically left on the body that would have been useful. Apparently there had been some hope when seminal fluid had been found on Charlotte, but then the DNA matched for Jeremy. Both of them had bruises and scars and lacerations beneath their white clothing. Jeremy, post-mortem, had been castrated. Charlotte had been found with an orchid just as Jeremy had. I didn't want to hear any more. I wanted to block out the world. Freddie was my only source of sanity in that time. He used to get in bed with me and hold me while I cried for hours. He hauled up the old TV and VCR and took Dad's car and drove all the way to Boise and back, 4 hours round trip, to get brand new movies and cold cheeseburgers that we could heat up and eat. It was comforting, even though the buns were chewy and the fries were soggy. It was comforting to the extent that anything can be comforting when you see how your boyfriend has been murdered and turned into a pot for a plant. It was the middle of July when the 3 latest bodies turned up. I was still in bed, though I'd been taking small walks in the afternoon. Freddie had even convinced me to get on a horse one day, and I'd gripped the reins until my knuckles went white, while Freddie spoke soothingly to the mare so she wouldn't buck. Then, after about 10 minutes, I got off and Freddie took my hand, and we walked back home, and I got back into bed. The morning after I'd gotten back on the horse, the bodies turned up. I'll spare you the details, except to tell you it was more of the same. Orchids, rape, and torture. One body with no identifiable cause of death, while the other 2 had been strangled. The ME guessed they'd all been killed at the same time, all kept for a day or 2 before their bodies were planted back at home. None of the funerals had taken place. All of the bodies were being kept in cold refrigeration units until the investigators decided there was nothing else of use. Of course, it wasn't those 2 detectives from Portland anymore. They'd been replaced by feds in black SUVs. People were leaving by then. In some cases, leaving was making them go broke. Several families I knew had just picked up and left in the middle of the night, spooked, saying they were going to stay with family in Eugene or Bend or Boise. Others sold off all their farm animals and tried to move ship and sell their land. No one wanted to buy, not in a town where children kept going missing. So they ended up losing most of what they had, but got to keep their children. In the 2 weeks between the end of July and when the surgeon took his next victims in August, the town became a shell of itself. I woke up from a nightmare on August 10th, 1988. In it, I'd been making love to Jeremy when suddenly roots sprouted from his mouth and ears and nose, and he started gurgling and choking and then fell dead on top of me. Even though I was screaming, the roots took hold of me, winding their way into my ears and nose and mouth, forcing their way down my throat. I woke up gasping. I hate to say it. I do. I hate what I'm about to tell you, because I think it makes me a terrible person. But part of me wishes I hadn't woken up that night. Part of me wishes I'd taken some drugs to go back to sleep. Then I never would have had to go through it. But I did. I didn't sleep through it. I did wake up and hear the rustling outside the window again, just like the night before Jeremy went missing. I did reach into my nightstand with my heart pounding and grasp my flashlight. I did go to the window. I did see a figure. 2 figures. A black vehicle of some sort. There was a figure, tall and large and shadowy, dragging another across the grass of my front yard. It was Freddie. I knew it was Freddie. And without even thinking, without even doing anything remotely smart like you'd think I'd have done, I ran down the stairs without my shoes and out onto the front porch. I ran into something strange and soft and cold and across the grass toward the figure. And I started yelling at that point, telling him to get away from my brother. The lights went on in my house, I think, because the shadows got worse. I was on him, then. He hit me hard across the face, then in the stomach. He picked me up like a rag doll and threw me in the back of a box truck. The metal sheet was rolled down and the world was black. I felt around with my hands, desperately reaching around for something to use to get out. But the only thing my fingers found were 2 sets of legs. I could hear yelling outside. There was banging on the back of the door, and I was screaming for my mom, my dad, for help. Then we were moving. It was pitch black in the back, and all I could do was feel around on my hands and knees. There were 2 other bodies back there, and one at a time I felt, until I could identify their chests and pressed my ear to them, listening for a heartbeat. I kicked against the side of the vehicle where the driver would be. I slammed my fists on the metal. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was another dream as we drove further and further away. I screamed until my throat went numb, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. I banged on the metal. I tried to open the back hitch. Finally, the car slowed. I started to cry. I knew I was going to die. I knew Freddie was going to die. Whoever else was in that trunk with us was going to die. And we were all going to die after something truly horrible was done to us. Then we would be dressed in white, and orchids would be planted in our skulls, and we would be deposited back at home. We were going to die. The hitch slid open. I lunged, scraping and kicking and screaming for all it was worth. I got a hand to the throat, a quick dart that sent me breathless and gasping for air. There was a hissing sound, and the sound of metal tumbling in the back of the van. I'd lost my voice and my air. I was going to die. I was going to die. I was going to die. It hurt. The gas. I looked for new air but couldn't. The air I gulped down was anything but pure and clean. It burned the inside of my throat, my nose, my eyes. I tried to scream but couldn't. I choked, sucked in more air to try and compensate, choked. The world got fuzzy. My stomach contracted and I vomited. I felt my thigh wet and thought I'd peed myself. I coughed, sucked up air, choked. I could feel myself suffocating, could feel my brain trying to get oxygen. That's all I remember, until I woke up in the surgeon's room. When I woke up, I was on a bed. The room was bright and white. Floodlights, that's what they call them. There were floodlights glaring down at us, so that when I closed my eyes, there was still this red fire. My entire body hurt, my lungs burned, and when I coughed, it sounded like it does when you have a cold that lingers far too long. My eyes hurt, stung, felt too dry. The exact feeling is hard to describe. Like every part of my body had been dried out. I would have done anything for some water. Freddie was on a bed, too. It was bright, but there's always a degree to which your eyes adjust. I remember lifting my head up to look at him, but my head throbbed so badly I had to put it back down. I turned my head enough to see that his chest was rising and falling. That was enough for that moment. The other room was taken up by a girl. Her face was turned away from me, but I thought I recognized her hair. I'll just tell you. Her name was Madeline Davis. She was my friend. I don't know how much time I spent on that cot when I first woke up. I remember turning over, trying to get my bearings, shoving my head into the pillow to try and block out the light. Eventually, Freddie and Madeline came too as well. But we were in cells made of something plastic, I think. We could put our hands up against the plastic, but we couldn't touch each other. Against the wall, out of our reach, were 3 orchids with long, hanging roots, a reminder of what would happen to us, eventually. I can't tell you how many hours I spent in that bed, at first wondering who had been there before me. I wondered if Jeremy had been on my cot. I was afraid. Yes. I was terrified of what would happen, but I also still ached for him. Part of me, a really fucked up and small part, wanted to see him again. I wondered what would happen when I died. The surgeon kept us there for what I think was an eternity before we saw him. There was no food and no water. I passed the time by turning on my side and counting as high as I could before I lost track. The floodlights never turned off. My eyes ached for sleep, but every time I felt myself drifting, a loud, high-pitched siren sounded that threatened to burst my eardrums. All three of us would scream, covering our ears from the noise until it abated. By that time, we had been yanked from sleep, and so it went. Finally, we saw him. I wish I could say that the surgeon was gruesome or terrible, but he looked like any other adult. He had glasses and wore slacks, held his hands behind his back when he walked. He had a cruel half-smile that was always on his face as he tortured me. He was in his 30s, maybe 40s, a grown man. The first time we saw him, he offered us bottles of water. He slid them through little slots in the plastic cells. I drank mine greedily. He left us. He didn't say a word. And so it began. The floodlights were so bright, so incredibly bright, that I almost didn't notice when the drugs started to change them. They tightened into thin streams of light, staring down at me. Then they turned to fire, burning my skin. Holding up my hands, I could see the flesh melting off, and I began to scream. The floor of my cell was covered in the roots of orchids, and they reached for me with long, waggling fingers. The very air itself was deadly. I could see that it had been changed from air to poison, and the few shadows that weren't eliminated by the floodlights turned to demons that watched me with piercing eyes. I tried to look for Freddie. In the cell over, he was curled up on his side with his knees to his chest. I watched as his flesh ate at itself. His clothes and skin were dying before my eyes, curling into black ash and dribbling down on his bed. Madeline's hair was made of snakes, their eyes staring at me as they opened their mouth to hiss. But my own hair was made of snakes, too. I pulled at it, tried to yank it out. I scratched at my skin until blood ran from it. I screamed until my throat went numb. This was the schedule. We were not allowed to sleep. The surgeon would enter, give us drugged water, and leave. We were caught then, between being drugged or going thirsty. My head hurt constantly. A corner of my cell, humiliating, horrible, I know, turned into my toilet. I pissed the bed when I was on the drugs. Eventually, I had sores along my legs. Watching Freddie and Madeline scream was almost worse than taking the drugs myself. There were times, after the effects had abated, that I thought of not drinking the water and letting myself die of thirst. I didn't know how long it would take. I knew it wouldn't be pleasant. I didn't notice when the surgeon came for Madeline the first time, or when he came for Freddie. I was in the middle of a hallucination about the floodlights. Those terrible fucking lights. I wanted to sleep. I wanted to cry. My entire body hurt. On the drugs, I could feel parts of myself that had no nerves. My hair hurt. My nails hurt. My eyelashes hurt. Every part of me on fire, itching, sweaty, smelly. He came for me, eventually. It was always while we were on drugs. Eventually, we just went with him. It was better than being punched and kicked and dragged through our own shit to get there. He would take us into a separate room and strap us to a table. There would be bands on our heads, our wrists, our ankles. That's where he would rape me, if he so saw fit. He would ask us questions about Middlefield and our parents and our friends. He never told us his name or anything about him. But he said that it was the town's fault that this was happening to us. I won't tell you everything he did to me, because it would take too long and be far too exhausting. I can tell you that he tortured us. He had tools, an entire array of them that he would spread out on a table before approaching us. He said he liked to watch us scream. I don't know how much time passed. We were rarely allowed to sleep, and the drugs kept us confused. Sometimes it seemed like years went by. Other times it felt like it had barely been a second between one visit to that table and the next. I remember my last time. I was crying. I was so tired. I was in so much pain. He told me it would be over soon. The human body could only take so much, he said. He would always tell us what he was going to do to us. I'm going to collapse your lung now, he would tell me. It will be uncomfortable. You will feel like you can't breathe. He was always right, too. He asked me about Jeremy. He asked me about how we had sex and what it was like. He asked me about the town. He broke my finger when I didn't talk. Drugs, torture, seeing the orchids on the wall. It formed a new time, a new era. In what I have to think was the day before Freddie died, the surgeon gave us a rare respite. We were all on our cots with the floodlights on. I mouthed the words to Bob Dylan songs to Freddie through the plastic barrier. Our full water bottles sat on the floor near our beds. It was a brief moment of lucidity. Freddie was crying. On the other side of me, Madeline had curled up and hugged her knees to her chest. None of us had been able to speak to each other since we had been taken. None of us had felt the touch of another person on us. None of us were allowed to sleep. Freddie died first. He was there, and then he just wasn't. The surgeon took him, and when he brought Freddie back, Freddie was dead. The surgeon dumped him on the floor of the plastic cell in the midst of Freddie's own waste. My brother's head was turned toward me, and his eyes were open. I was almost glad, because it meant that he wasn't going to suffer anymore. None of us were going to suffer anymore. It was time. I'd given up by then. I didn't care. It was going to hurt. It was going to be unbearable. It was going to be torture. At one point, I had refused to drink the drugged water he gave us. In return, the surgeon had drugged my food. The living nightmares returned. I drank the water. What was the point of trying to resist? He strangled Madeline in front of me. But he didn't strangle me. Instead, he picked up both the bodies, Madelina and my brother, and dumped them in my cell. I cradled Freddie's head in my lap. I ran my fingers through his hair. No more water came, no more food. The surgeon did not come and collect me to torture me after that. I was alone. They tell me it was 3 days. 3 days that I sat with my dead brother's head in my lap, cradling him and rocking back and forth, unable to sleep. Soon we'll all be together, I would whisper to him. I sang songs to him. There were no drugs, but still sometimes I would look down at him and see his skin melting from his face. I would see his jaw turn into a gaping hole before my eyes. When I blinked, it was over. What I'm told is that, because of the commotion I made, they were able to see the kind of car the surgeon drove. They found clues. The G-men in their black SUVs and tinted shades. The surgeon went out after killing Freddie and Madeline and dumping them in my cell, got cornered, and had killed himself rather than given himself up. But they found me. I don't remember what it was like being found. There are many memories, fragmented and smashed to bits. Did I think they were angels? Did I think I was dead? It's hard to say now. I stopped talking. For 6 months, they put me in a special hospital, and I didn't talk. I developed severe agoraphobia. I would hide under my bed, clutching my knees to my chest and shaking. I had incessant nightmares where I would wake up clawing at the air, screaming, thrashing. Naturally, there were no orchids in that wing of the hospital. The police tried to question me. They wanted to know everything that had happened to me, every sordid detail. I would tell them, eventually, but not then. I had to be sedated again. I was told that I went far away. My parents thought that whatever the surgeon had done to me, it had ripped the soul right out of me. His name was Jonathan Miller. He was 46. When he was 18, 10 years before I was born, his mother had found the remains of animals he had killed as a child buried in their yard. His father, William Miller, had driven him up to Lake Owyhee under the guise of a graduation present, knocked him unconscious, and thrown him in the lake to drown. Then they'd claimed he went up by himself, that it had been an accident. The town had mourned Jonathan Miller, and then moved on. The doctors told me this while I was still mute, staring at the ceiling of the hospital room. The Millers had been arrested. I didn't go to Freddie's funeral. I didn't go to any of them. Eventually, I spoke again. I drank water without fear. I took a step outside, and then another. I let my father hug me. My parents sold the farm. Everyone did. No one wanted to live in that town anymore. The government came through and bought all the land and turned it into some sort of factory. We moved to California, the warm part. My room had blackout curtains, so that whenever the light became too much, I could close them and experience the dark. I never got over it, I guess you could say. I healed. The scars on my body disgusted me less and less. I met a man who lets me sleep with a gun in the nightstand drawer and who holds me when I wake up screaming. I wish I could say something else came from it. I wish I could say Freddie's death meant something. 8 children died at the hands of Jonathan Miller. It destroyed my life. I can't tell you the number of times I've thought about killing myself. But the thing that keeps me from doing it is Freddie. I got to live, and he didn't. He died. Madeline died. I sat with their dead bodies for 3 days before they found me. So I stay alive for Freddie, because he didn't get a choice. For better or for worse, I do.